podcast. I'm your host, Laura Sutherland. I'm a Stakeholder Engagement Specialist, and I am delighted today to welcome a new guest, Rod Cartwright.
Hey Laura, very good to be here. Thanks for asking me on.
No, thanks for taking the time to come on, and we've got a really interesting discussion lined up for everybody today, which really kind of looks into the nitty-gritty of crisis communication, and also some of the challenges that our industry are facing right now as well. Both you and I have worked in crisis communication, you very much more recently than me from the conversation we were having earlier on. But I think the first thing to maybe have a chat about, particularly for those that aren't necessarily working crisis communication, is the difference between issues and crisis in communication.
Absolutely. I mean, on one level, they are very different, but they're also a continuum. I mean, I think if you look at the wonderful case study of the European Super League recently, I was joking on various social channels that they've combined two previously separate disciplines. One is a launch and the other is a crisis, because they seemed that they launched straight into a crisis. But to your original question, I mean, an issue is anything that has the potential to increase scrutiny on an organization, whereas a crisis is something so fundamental that it has the ability to disrupt the organization's ability to go about its business and do business in the normal way. In other words, it is potentially existential, both in the short and in the long term. Although my sort of main definition of a crisis is a human experience with human implications, which requires a human response based on human empathy. And I know we'll come on to chat about that later. But yeah, above all else, the difference is the extent to which it's existential, both short and long term.
And from our perspective, being public relations specialists and advisors, we obviously are looking at it from a reputational perspective, which obviously then has an impact on, again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the likes of investors, the likes of stocks and shares, supply chain, staff, everything. It really has that massive effect. But I think the biggest point and the biggest differentiation is that with an issue, you have the opportunity to identify it way before an issue even occurs through a risk register. And also, before it even becomes a crisis, if it's an issue, you have an opportunity to manage it. But obviously, it's either when people don't see the red flags or they don't handle the issue properly that then the crisis might hit. But there are also other circumstances where a crisis will just come out of nowhere.
I agree. And I think that, there are 2 points in there that are worth picking up. One is you used the word risk. And, in a way, whether it's issues or whether it's crisis, it's always ultimately about the prediction, the prioritization, the mitigation and the management of reputational risk. And I think that while none of us are God and can see around every single corner, a lot of what I do is about helping organizations to be systematic about the way in which they identify potential risks and prioritize them and prepare for them. Because, one of the things that frustrates me as people talk about PR crises, there's barely ever such a thing. 99% of, in inverted commas, you can't do that in audio, but 99% of PR crises are caused by some combination of leadership, decision-making, structure, culture, they are and operations. They are very rarely caused in the first instance by the comms function, and yet the comms function is looked to make the crisis go away and to clean up after what was originally an operational issue.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing though. Like, again, our industry really does get stuck on, what is PR? What do we call ourselves? What are we in charge of? Do we own this? Do we own that? But actually, when people say PR crisis, what they actually mean is it's just actually bad press. I don't think they necessarily mean it's a crisis that's derived from the PR or the communication function. It's just they actually don't know what they're talking about in the first place.
Indeed, and the bad press, again, in 99% of cases, is caused by the underlying organisation and its behaviour and its decisions, not by the comms function.
Because we don't have editorial control after all, anyway. So,
correct.
And if if something is being reported on, it's because media has the role to hold organisations to account. So
indeed.
But it's really interesting because I think when when students are taught, not necessarily when they're taught about this sort of thing, but generally it's like some sort of natural or human disaster or something like that. But there are so many different types of crises within different organizations, and the majority of them are actually human related. If you talk about like cybersecurity and things like that, those sorts of crises are hit normally because of human error in some way, shape or form. So it's, I think, like back to that, risk register that we talked about before, that is an absolute key part of what we need to be doing and working on with businesses and organizations to mitigate that risk in the first place. So identifying it and having measures in place.
I couldn't agree more. And, a couple of weeks ago, I did a sizable risk assessment and prioritization workshop with a client who will obviously remain nameless in the charity sector. And having gone through this systematic, management consulting style process that I use, all of the reputational risks that rose to the top right-hand corner of the 9 box were ultimately to do either with human frailty, error, vulnerability, or cruelty, or the poor treatment of other people. At the end of the day, all of the things that were, if you like, pure systems or processes were less risky, less likely and less impactful than the ones either caused by or impacting human beings. I heard a great quote once that, the definition of a crisis is something, it's the 3 Ps, something that either hurts people, the planet, or pets. And I love that because you get all 3 and then you're really in trouble. Hurt a cat, then you're off the scale in trouble.
Hurt a dog and you'll have me to deal with.
I know this to be true.
Which brings us on lovely to the next point, which is one of the crises that we're all talking about just now, something that I'm working on with the PRCA is around environment and climate, and the term ESG is used and bandied about quite a lot now. Whilst it might summarize nicely for some leaders or for some groups to understand, the ESG is actually 3 different words, and although they come together at some point, they actually are 3 separate individual concerns of an organization. So environmental, social, and governance. And I do have an issue with the fact that it's banded together, but I do understand to an extent why some people do it. But what's your experience of this, particularly in recent months, because it's a fairly new term that's been thrown about?
Yeah, I mean, I've got mixed views on ESG as it relates to comms. I mean, I think that along with nearly everything else, COVID has been an accelerant to things that were happening already, rather than creating a brand new world. So, lots of people were saying, okay, in the COVID environment, the environment will fall off the agenda because there are more important things. Whereas what we've seen, and there's lots of hard data around this, is that the trend for investors to be looking to organizations to be mitigating environmental and climate risk, to be looking to people to treat their employees and their stakeholders and their communities well, issues of mental health, well-being, patterns of working have all actually been accelerated by COVID. And I think that the reason I mentioned that is because we've been on this journey from CSR to corporate responsibility to purpose. What has happened with ESG is it's hardwired those considerations into how companies report, how they're valued, and how they're viewed reputationally. So I absolutely agree that all three of them in their own right are important. And talking to lots of ESG specialists, the environment and the governance ones are particularly preponderant at the moment. But I also see why they're bandied together, because of that hard wiring into the reporting and the valuation cycle.
And that brings me on to a subject I love talking about. It's what I do primarily with all my clients. It's just, and it's something I love, because it's fundamentally part of what we should always be doing, which actually we don't always do in our roles, but stakeholder engagement, which starts with the research. And you talk about the acceleration for digital transformations coming forward, and people are really putting purpose and people at the center of their businesses and organizations, and I think they have an opportunity to do that now, which is brilliant. It's a chance to review, it's a chance to modernize and push forward, but it starts with this sort of stakeholder engagement piece, where you need to be doing the research to find out what is close to people's hearts and what matters to them, and aligning, your organization with their values. And I think that's where, again, the term greenwashing has come from. We as PR advisors should be advising as the conscience and the hearts and the mind of an organization, the leadership teams around what this means and why they should be doing it. But I think there's there's probably like a nervousness around being too vocal about what people are doing or what they're not doing, because they don't fully understand what they can and should be doing, even though there are plenty of resources out there. You know what it's like. We have to handhold people a lot in our roles, don't we?
Indeed. Yeah.
and I think that when it comes back to the hearts and minds and the advisory role that we have, that if we're equipped with the stakeholder research and the language that they use and everything like that, we can go and say, this is what they care about, this is why we should be doing it, this is what's happening to the world, this is why we should be doing it. And it's not just a finger in the wind approach, it's not greenwashing, it's not just because everyone else is doing it, it's actually because it needs to be happening.
Yeah, and I think there's so many things in what you just said. I mean, where do I start with that? I think that if you look at some of the comms functions that have genuinely, in a visionary way, led their organization. I know that Unilever's comms function established itself at the core of the board by being the core source of horizon scanning, not just from a reputational perspective, but from a business perspective. And I think, to your point about, stakeholder research, absolutely. Stakeholder research plus constant social listening, both inside and outside the organization. If you want one example of how not to do it, we were talking earlier about the European Super League. I mean, someone sent me a DM saying, did they do any stakeholder engagement? They seem to launch their crisis without having talked to a single interested party internally or externally. And then they wonder why the whole thing, it was quite heroic, had fallen to bits within 48 hours. So I've written extensively on that. I won't bore you with it, but it was a case in point of how not to do it, and will be part of every crisis training deck, I believe, for the next decade or so.
We touched on at the start of the discussion there in ESG about investors. And, one of the things that our industry is not particularly great at, in my personal opinion, and that's from having spoken to in-house teams and agency heads, all over, that we're not great at standing up and saying no. We're not great at challenging boards and leaders. And that's because we are, worried for our jobs. We don't want to step out of line. We don't want to be seen as troublemakers, etc. But again, coming back to that advisory role, the critical friend that we need to be, I think it's important that we are in that position and able to challenge for the right reasons, with the right ammunition and the right data and backup. I really think that's important.
And I think you've put your finger on it with those last couple of points about data and backup, is that, why do the management consultancies inhabit the boardroom more than PR people. And I know that's a generalization, but it's not it's not a very wide of the mark one. It's because they are prepared to take in system and process and methodology that gives them not only a methodological way of appealing to the board, but also data to back that up. And a lot of what I've been doing from both a qual and quant perspective is building tools and models that allow us to go in with the confidence of those methodologies and those data, because without it, and believe me, experience is absolutely fundamental. Instinct is critical, but experience and instinct delinked from data and methodology just look like experience and instinct.
Yeah, and I think that then has a danger of looking more reactive or more argumentative than the full package, and that's when you get the respect and the trust and the sort of two-way listening between advisor role and board. And again, kind of coming back to that investor piece, that it is known through data and through research that's been undertaken that investors are not going to be investing in companies and organizations which don't have good green credentials, which aren't positively making an impact socially, and are doing their piece to actually reduce carbon footprint, invest back into society. And some of the examples of even the football stuff that you were talking about is great, in that sort of part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, without geeking out too much on the ESG side, I mean, now that you have things like the SASB financial materiality matrix, try saying that 10 times fast, which has, particularly in the governance pillar, an awful lot about the identification, mitigation, and management of risk, including reputational risk. As I say, investors are looking at this in a hard material way that they weren't before. And although, I'm being self-effacing and saying we're geeking out, as an industry, we kind of have to geek out and get familiar with this stuff if we want to rise up the value chain and be seen as substantial and substantive advisors that we all aspire to be.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where, a lot are missing the mark, I think. There's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But then, kind of coming back to this idea of hearts and minds and people and planet, it all revolves around humans and being people. And obviously the podcast is called People by People. And one of my favorite phrases is that people are turning into brands and brands are turning into people. Mm. And when you're responding to crises, you have to humanize your response. You have to mean it. You have to talk with feelings and emotion and being sensitive to the situation. And I think that's a huge part of, again, where brands can fail and can be really, the fingers pointed at them for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of thoughts there. I mean, at my last agency, we developed a model where I talk these days about what I call the human imperative, and the idea that, the brands who rise to the top will be those who engage with human needs, human wants, but also human beliefs and values. If you look at all the data about which crises become long-lasting in their impact, it's the ones where the human emotions are anger and disgust, because what you're doing is you're offending people's basic sense of decency and justice, of doing the right thing. The second was that when I was at Ketchum, we did this global study looking at public perceptions of leadership and communication, and we looked specifically at expectations of leaders in a crisis. And bear with me, because this is a story which merits telling. Out of a list of, I think, 15 attributes of the leaders in a crisis, the relatively, and I stress, relatively least important facets were showing empathy and communicating openly. And we got the data and went, this is crazy, the data must be wrong. Then we looked at the two most important, and they were having a clear plan of action to fix the problem and clearly identifying the nature of the challenge. And then the scales fell away. And I coined this phrase, operationalizing empathy, which is you have to be empathetic because it answers the question, do they care? But then you have to act upon it, because it answers the question, and now are they going to do something? So a lot of the crisis work that I do is based around the idea of acknowledging, apologizing, and acting, the 3 A's, because I think that empathy without action looks just like warm words, and action without empathy looks cold-hearted.
Very true. And when you're planning these scenarios and how you're responding to them, when you're originally setting out against your risk register and your whole plan, that all needs to be taken into consideration. But the main thing is that the right approach is taken with the actual heartfelt response, rather than someone that's coming out just to turn on the waterworks to appease, which is, again, which is going to lengthen out the whole process, and people are going to pick up on it.
You mean, like, for example, the Secretary of State crying oddly on TV? I mean, I just picked that as a random example. He says sarcastically, given that we're not on video.
And tell me more about your match fit model, because this is a new thing you've been working on developing, and you launched, which is why we originally started speaking, and it's been kind of pushed out, but we're here now talking about it. Tell us about that.
And in fact, the launch of Match Fit has been pushed out, so it's sort of happening sometime in the next few weeks. So I mean, Match Fit is basically an intentionally simple crisis preparedness model that is designed basically to deliver a small handful of outcomes. One is personal confidence and team unity. I talk a lot about human preparedness, because for me, it's the human side that underpins the other parts of the model, which is organizational resilience and business performance. So that's what it's there to achieve. The model itself is basically in 5 simple parts, which are diagnose, rank, review, train, and test. And they're purposefully modular in that you don't have to do all of them, and modular in that you don't have to do all of them in a specific order, because every organization is different in its needs and its level of preparedness. And I think just to pull out 2, I think, particularly important elements of the model. One is the diagnostic. It's a quantitative tool, which is essentially a type form survey that allows an organization to assess its level of crisis preparedness against 40 points of proven best practice, which throws up an overall percentage score and a Google-style star rating, and then that score and that star rating across 4 specific domains. What does that do? It gives you a measurable and quantifiable guide as to where you should be investing to enhance your organization resilience, but also, crucially, it creates a measurement baseline that says, we did it in April 2021, in April 2022, we're going to rerun it, and we're going to set ourselves specific measurable targets. So in a way, it's bringing some system and, crucially, some measurement into crisis preparedness. And then the second, which is the rank phase, which is the management consulting 9-box tool that I mentioned, where you work with the senior leadership team to identify, rank, and prioritize your key risks at both a macro and a micro level. So you have a quant tool and you have a qual tool, which together guide you as to where you should be investing your dollar, pound, or euro to deliver the greatest return on investment in terms of your resilience.
And these sorts of things can be adapted, as you say, to suit the individual businesses. But I think it's important that organizations understand that they do have to start proactively looking at these things in advance. And that is key, even if it's just baby steps to start with. But I think that's the thing. I mean, I worked for a client, oh goodness, it must have been about 2 or 3 years ago now, a large property investment company. And they had a lot of sites across the UK which operated where the members of the public could be or work. And none of those sites had crisis communication plans in place.
Mm-hmm.
We had crisis plans, e.g. evacuation, but their perception was, well, we're not going to have, a terrorist situation here or hijacking, we're not that type of site. But they didn't think of all the human stuff we were talking about, really, like, this is when you have to start preparing businesses and organizations for things like, suicide, or things like, holdups, or children going missing or being abducted, like really serious things that just don't go on in people's heads.
I agree. And I think the challenge is that very often an organization will say, well, we have a risk register and we have risk preparedness, but it's invariably operational risk. It's not human and reputational risk. And I think that, one of the final phase of the model, I work with Polpio, who you probably know, Kate Hartley and team. So they're hardwired into the model, and I'm hardwired into them as one of their facilitators. And interestingly, when I've done simulations with clients with Polpio, you tend to start with an operational scenario, a product failure or a service failure. And as the day goes on, you introduce more and more human decision making and more corporate behavior, which underlines your point. Although things tend to start operationally, very often it's the lack of human preparedness that can cause the crisis to become exacerbated rather than managed.
Yeah, and I think that we can have like protocols and processes in place, but if they haven't been identified, those specific things in the first place, then you're relying on instinct or someone's general preparedness of themselves to be able to stay calm and carry on the situation. And we are talking about not, it's not leadership teams, it's management level sometimes on sites where actually they're not decision makers, and then there's a ranking as to how fast that escalates and where it goes. So surely, what we do needs to become part of resilience, future proofing, general common sense, and everything else in between.
I couldn't agree more. And back to the point about structures, organizations will say, well, we have a crisis management committee and we have a crisis management chair and a team. And then you say, well, do you know that the CMC chair is temperamentally right for every type of crisis? Have you looked at the interpersonal dynamics of the people in the team? Is the CMC chair well regarded by everybody? And I think that very often when you scratch beneath the surface, and also unless you build in care of human beings with rest periods and rotas and so on, it doesn't matter how good your structures. Frankly, it doesn't matter how good the individuals are. Human beings need sleep and rest, and they need to get on together. And for me, the ultimate test in crisis situations is the team trust and the team dynamic, not the brilliance of the crisis plan or the brilliance of the individuals.
Yes, it's definitely team effort, and people can't handle stuff like that themselves. And those that may want to definitely have to have additional resources, which is again why it's great to have a good network of other PR professionals that you know and trust and you can work with, and things like that. Because if you don't, then you'd be working on it yourself and you wouldn't have any sleep. I know.
And I think to your point about networks not only within PR and marketing services, but beyond. I was involved with a thing last year called the Decision Circle, where, there was me, there was Stuart Bruce, who's digital and social and measurement and frankly everything, Lou Watson from a consumer marketing and brand perspective, but also an employment lawyer, a business psychologist, and a business continuity expert. Because frankly, we have no monopoly on anything on our own. There has to be collaboration across disciplines and across specialisms.
Yeah, which brings us to an even wider point, still relevant, but much, much wider, is that, when we talk about, diversity within our work, is I referred to it last year as diversity of people, diversity of thinking, and diversity of skills, because all too often we're happy to recruit from within our own industry, or we're happy to, kind of stick within our bubbles. Whereas actually, to be diverse, we need to think out with. And that was one of the things that it came up last year, actually, at PR Face, when we were talking about diversity in the wider spectrum, was that, if you're building like the teams for the future, then you need to be thinking about recruitment from, with specialist skills that we don't even have, we maybe haven't even thought of in our own industry. If you're talking about HR or legal, all that type of stuff, software development, coding, and coding is something I talked about years ago that, PR practitioners should have skills in. I'm not saying that every PR practitioner should have coding skills, but maybe there are some that will be specialist, or maybe it's just that we recruit coders and not PR people with those skills.
Yeah, and I think it's, you've raised a really important point for us as individual practitioners, is you can't be expert at everything, but you need, as a former head of digital in an agency I worked in said, the reason you're quite good, Rod, is because you know just enough to be dangerous, but also when you've run out of knowledge and you have to bring the experts in. And I think that we are, to some extent, ringmasters. We are there to pull together, to horribly mix my metaphors, the full orchestra, rather than trying to believe or claim that we can play violin as well as we believe we can play the cymbals or the trombone. That metaphor just broke itself in all sorts of horrible ways.
But it's true, it's very true. And it also, I think it shows great strength in people who understand when they have reached that point, and they do reach out to the other specialists in other areas to bring them in, and they don't try and do all things themselves. I mean, I would say I'm probably a generalist in terms of, because I have such a broad skill base, that does cover like everything. But I do know when it's time to bring in legal to talk to them, if if it's IP infringement, or if it's cease and desist type stuff, then they're things we cannot do and we don't have the expertise in, and we should be speaking to other professionals about. And that's when you start to see great work being done, when the whole world of management starts to work together, not just operate in silos, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the same applies back to your point about diversity, is also knowing both the limits of your own knowledge, experience, and background. By background, I mean, where you were brought up, the nature of your education. I, as a, white, middle-aged, middle-class, university-educated married man, by definition, lack a whole world of learned and lived experience. And if I'm going to advise, I need either to bring in people who match that experience with their diversity of thought, background, and experience, or I need to know how to ask the right questions so that I'm starting to reflect rounded advice rather than looking down the blinkers of my own experience.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where I think that, we as an industry are, how should I put it, trying, but not necessarily walking the walk and talking the talk, and vice versa. We're partly making headways in some ways, but then there are other ways where I don't think that we're making that much of a dent, and we're not really meaningfully and really embedding that. I mean, I was having a conversation with somebody earlier this morning who was talking about an agency that they had worked with, and this agency I would see is fairly reputable, and has all the bells and whistles, let's say, and the person that went to work there was shocked at how against the grain of what their external perception is about actually internally how it does not match up. And that was quite eye-opening to hear. Well, eye-opening to hear that. Because you do have a perception, don't you, of people talking the talk, and we're doing this and we've achieved that and we've put this in place, but actually, have you made that impact? Let's actually see and demonstrate and report against it. And that's the thing about accountability. If you're not reporting and you're not demonstrating that you're actually doing something, then are you actually doing anything at all? No.
Indeed, and there's that whole question of expectation setting and expectation management. Of there's the famous maxim in PR of the say-do gap. As you'll know, the gap between what you say, the expectation that creates, and then your ability to meet those expectations in what you do. And I think there's a delicate balance that, as everyone very correctly rushes headlong into rectifying the real issues of diversity and inclusion that we've had, that we also need to avoid over claims about how much we've achieved already, but at the same time genuinely celebrating progress. Because when I look at a number of agencies, there's a group of agencies who've become B Corp. I'm not going to call out specific names, but there are some really impressive agencies who, on diversity, inclusion, ethics, going carbon zero, there is this new generation of agency who's really setting the pace.
And those agencies are going to be the ones that get the good clients, because people start to invest in them, retain great staff, attract new great staff and teams. And they're the ones that will have that sort of much better, I suppose, if you're looking down, a much better spread of those skills and experiences, which brings together that whole diversity piece, because then people are able to work across different specialist areas and be really great at what they do. And that's how great businesses are really made in our industry, aren't they?
Culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. Yeah.
And on that note, thanks so much for your time and for the great chat. It's always good to talk to people that are on the same wavelength as you, and obviously you've got great experiences to share as well. It'd be good to kind of extract some of those stories someday, without the names, obviously.
Indeed, over a glass of wine in Glasgow. I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks, Rod. When I was listening back to that podcast and I was editing it, it just kind of brought it back to me how much I enjoy talking to people about what we do. And when you get people that really know that sort of in-depth way of, that part of the discussion or that specific area of expertise, and you can just carry on chatting for ages and having a bit of a laugh at the same time. And that's why I suppose I love this podcast, because it's that sort of outlet when you can do that, and you can limit people to 20 minutes if you want, or you can carry on talking. And I was going to cut out more to make the podcast shorter, but I think you get a better picture of really what our whole conversation was about by leaving the majority of it in. So that just leaves me to say thank you to you for tuning in. As always, please do leave a review. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can get the next episode straight to your latest your podcast app. If you've got any suggestions for speakers, or if you want to be a speaker yourself or a guest on the show, please do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at Laura from Aura on most channels, and you can find my details in the show notes. And I'll also add Rod's in there as well. So thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, I will see you all soon.